Biura przestają być miejscem, do którego przychodzimy codziennie, bo tak trzeba. Dane nie kłamią. Hybrydowy model pracy zmienia rytm tygodnia i sposób, w jaki korzystamy z przestrzeni biurowej. Hej, słuchasz właśnie LoftCast, podcastu marki Loftmill. W dzisiejszym odcinku przyglądamy się przyszłości biur. Jak elastyczne modele pracy, różnorodność przestrzeni i edukacyjne funkcje biura mogą wspierać kulturę organizacyjną, integrację zespołów i rozwój kompetencji pracowników.
Hello, listeners and viewers of LoftCast. This is a podcast provided to you by Loftmill from Poland, where we do talk about real estate, where we talk about offices, about the office environment. My name is Wiktor, Doktór, and I am the host of today's show, and my special guest is not from Poland. This is the person who I bring you from UK. Hello and welcome, Dr. Lee Elliott from Knight Frank. Hi, Lee, how are you?
Hi, Victor. Great to be with you today. Really well, thank you.
Thank you very much. So tell us a little bit about yourself. What do you do on a daily basis in Knight Frank?
Yeah, so I'm Global Head of Occupier Research at Knight Frank. Effectively, that means I have the very privileged position of going around the world, visiting real estate markets and understanding how companies are using real estate. Predominantly offices, but also increasingly, because of the nature of the world, looking at industrial assets as well. And I spent 25 years in the industry, the last 10 of which have been with Knight Frank. Clearly, you know, the wants and needs of occupiers are becoming very pertinent now in a market which is perhaps a little more challenging, and particularly given the experiences that we've had during and post-COVID, where the whole world of work and workplace has been upended. So I've been pretty busy over the last few years trying to make sense of all of that and hopefully get a chance to share some of that with you today.
Oh, definitely. This is one of the reasons why we meet. So we will go a little bit deeper into this subject. Usually when I do talk to people from UK, they are based in London. Are you based in London?
This is correct, yeah. So I'm about 30 minutes away from London in terms of home, but Knight Frank as a business is headquartered in the West End of London. It's home. And has been for my entire life.
Okay, so let's go a little bit deeper into our conversation. I can also tell you that this is the first English podcast which we are running in the series of the LoftCasts. The previous two ones were in Polish, but we want to make it international. We want to make it accessible for not only Polish speakers, but also for those who do speak English. So this is the first time. We need to be really good on this talk.
I'll do my best. I feel very privileged now, and the pressure's on.
Okay, so correct me if I'm wrong, but if I will take a step back, like to the year 2019, it was completely different environment when it comes to the real estate industry. Nobody was thinking about the high-scale remote work, and everybody was very much focused on the offices. Then the pandemic came. The world has changed dramatically, but we can see that now we do have some comebacks to the previous reality. You have mentioned that you are running the analysis of this market. So do you think that the world will be the same as before 2019 or rather not?
No, it's not going back to where it was before. I know there are many in the property sector that would love it to go back to 5 days a week office occupancy. I think that's a thing of the past. And I actually think that's quite good from the perspective of people that work for a living. And I also think it's positive for the market. It doesn't mean the death of the real estate market's far from it. If you roll the clock back to 2019, yes, the majority of people were working in offices 5 days a week, 7 hours a day. Then we had the pandemic, which upended things. Don't forget, there was some flexible working prior to COVID. There were people that worked flexibly. And many of the trends that we've actually seen, Victor, that have come through subsequent to the pandemic, many of those trends were already in evidence. We were beginning to see in 2019. I'm the author of our Your Space research at Knight Frank, which we first launched in 2018. Back in 2018, I was talking about amenity-rich office buildings, using amenity as a way of actually attracting people to work for companies. I was talking about flexible space. I was talking about flexible work. I was talking about many of the trends that have now become very common to us all subsequent to the COVID experience. So I think what COVID has done, the way I look at COVID, it's done two things really. Firstly, it's led to a speeding up of the evolution of the office product on a trajectory that it was already on, but there's been that pace of change has improved and been enhanced. And the second thing is that we were thrust into what I've been known to talk about before, the great global workplace experiment. Effectively what COVID did, particularly in the early months of COVID, where we were all forced, we had no other option but to work remotely, is got us to really think critically about the future of work and workplace, and perhaps address some of the issues that we perhaps shied away from, both as business leaders but also as a real estate community as well. And I think the long-term outcome, as I see it from the COVID experience, is that we'll have a better work-life balance, we'll have better work styles, and we'll have better offices. Higher quality offices with more amenity, more flexibility, better environments, better experiences for people. And then there's lots of learnings that we picked up over the last 6 years since COVID finished. I've just come back from Australia. Perhaps we can talk about that later, but there's some real good practice that we're seeing in markets like Australia that I think are symptomatic of where the rest of the world might head. That's really hard for me to say as an Englishman, giving Australians credit, but you have to give it where it's due.
Yeah, you mentioned in one of your first sentences about the office occupancy. So maybe let's leave the pandemic behind us. There were many things which were being said when the pandemic was still on, when it was a returning topic, and so on and so on. Now we are living in a more hybrid type of work. There is a different approach to the offices, and focusing on the office occupancy. How does it look now? Do we see that those offices which are still in place, they are like full houses, that people are coming to them, every desk is being occupied, or there is a different approach to that?
Well, I think the first thing you got to say, Victor, is that I always have this slight issue with journalists. Journalists always phone me up and ask me when do we get back to 100% occupancy? We've never been at 100% occupancy. So firstly, we need to set the bar in the right place. Pre-COVID, occupancy rates typically for an office building were somewhere between 75 and 80%, and they were at that level pretty much 5 days a week. I think the big difference from COVID, but as I mentioned, it was already happening pre-COVID, but exacerbated by COVID, has been that our relationship with the office has become more fluid and more flexible. You're absolutely right to point to hybrid work. It's not the only work style that's out there, but 50% of the corporate real estate leaders that we've surveyed for the most recent edition of Your Space, that's 300 leaders around the world managing about 650 million square foot of real estate. 50% of them say that hybrid is the future. But I think there's a little bit of a misnomer about what that actually means from a real estate perspective. So let me just try and unpack that a little bit for you. From an occupancy standpoint, what it means is that you get a bell curve distribution of occupancy. Let's keep things simple. I know there are different ways of managing hybrid, but let's just say, for example, that a hybrid, which I define as 3 days a week in the office, 2 days remote, it leads to Mondays and Fridays being your weaker days of occupancy. Occupancy probably gets no more than 20% of capacity. And then Wednesday is your peak day when everybody is in, and it's sort of a pre-COVID norms. Very difficult as a real estate leader, as an occupier of space, to get the flexibility that one requires. So what we've seen as the predominant response from occupiers adopting a hybrid work style is they need to have enough space to accommodate the 80% that come in on a Wednesday, and they're prepared to deal with the inefficiency of space either side of that peak. So what I say, what I see in talking to corporate real estate leaders is, for the last couple of years, the majority of leaders that have gone into a hybrid setting have been managing for the peak, planning for the peak. So what they want is they want enough space to ensure that when they're at their peak occupancy or peak part of hybrid on a Wednesday, in my example, they've got enough desks for everybody. and they've been prepared to deal with the inefficiency that comes from that model. We're now starting to see, I was in India about 3 months ago, and even there we're starting to see a slightly different approach now. I think one of the problems we've got is not only the sort of pandemic experience, but also you've got to look at the macroeconomy. The macroeconomy is low growth for longer. And because it's low growth for longer, occupiers, businesses will be looking at space and looking to manage the costs of real estate. And as a result, that inefficiency that comes from planning for the peak is probably being questioned a little bit more, not so much by staff or by corporate real estate leaders, but by CFOs. You know, CFOs always visit buildings on a Monday or a Friday when they're empty. You know, they never tend to visit on a Wednesday. So in this, obviously they're going to be sharpening their pencils. They're going to be looking to try and bring a bit of efficiency. And one of the behaviors that we're now seeing is not planning for that peak occupancy, but actually trying to reduce the delta between peak and trough. So what that means in essence is that companies are needing to think about hybrid in a more staggered fashion. So for example, across an organization, you may have a hybrid model, but you'll say to some teams, you come in Monday to Wednesday, other teams, you come in Tuesday to Thursday, etc. And as a result, you can bring that space requirement down, and therefore the occupier generally makes better use of the space and probably needs less space as well. But we're very early in that journey. Most people have actually either made their decisions on a whim as we went into COVID. So there were some of the bigger occupiers that were long on space that lost parts of their footprint because of COVID. And then we've had others that have basically said, no, we're going to sit still and see how the world of work plays out. And we're going to ensure that we can accommodate people on that peak, in that peak style. So that's broadly the implications of it.
Some time ago, I met such a description like a smart hybrid, which means that actually those are the teams who should be together within the office, when the other teams may work on the day just outside in the hybrid model or just remotely, completely. Mm-hmm. That means that actually it takes care about the culture of a team, about the communication, about all of these things, what people are doing in the smaller group, and they are all together grouped, either, let's say, starting from Monday to Wednesday, where the other group comes on Thursdays and Fridays, and are doing exactly the same. So they are building some business relationship between them, and not necessarily via the cameras like we are talking now.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Well, I think face-to-face contact is always better. I mean, you know, what COVID proved is that we can work in 2 dimensions in a digital platform and do it pretty effectively. But what we do in working in 2 dimensions is we generally harvest social capital that we've made by meeting people in person. So people used to say to me 6 months into COVID, well, everybody's managed to work remotely. That was a success. You know, most businesses mobilized technology and were able to work remotely very, very quickly. These were companies that didn't necessarily have the right IT equipment when you used to go into their offices, but somehow got everything working. But what people were doing was building relationships or continuing relationships that had already formed in person in offices or in towns and cities that haven't necessarily been replenished at the same pace. So I'm a big believer in hybrid. I'm a big believer in flexible working, but I'm also a huge believer in the office, because I think the office does a number of things. It brings people together, it galvanizes culture, it brings clients and suppliers into an occupier's space, which is important for business development, and it creates those innovative moments as well if it's well designed. We don't necessarily need to be there 5 days a week for all of that to happen, but we need to be there some part of the week for sure. And I think most companies now, you remember when we first went into COVID, a lot of the big tech companies were talking about, you know, fully remote working models forever, and, you know, we'll all work in a distributed fashion. Even the tech companies, even the Googles of this world, have started to push back a little bit on that original sort of utopian view and have gone back to a hybrid sort of model. They've demanded more of their people come into the office for that very reason, that they want to generate culture or galvanize culture, and they want to innovate around products.
I am taking some notes once you are saying, and I already put down 5 times the word flexibility, or
yes.
to be flexible. And Now a question concerning this, because flexibility we may define differently about the number of desks or whatever, yeah? And then you mentioned the word design. So does this flexibility also apply to the way how the offices are now being constructed within? So those are not like open spaces like they were some time ago, but I can see that there are some changes also within this environment when we invite people to offices to stay together, to work together, that there are different functions nowadays, aren't they?
There are. So I think you're absolutely right to point out the F word of property, which is flexibility. It means a lot of things to different people. The way I look at it is very simply that I think there are three sort of forms of flexibility. There's lease flexibility, i.e. shorter leases with more options, which give people more wriggle room to ensure that real estate is more aligned with their businesses. I think there's flexibility within buildings. So one of the big trends, I mentioned Australia earlier, one of the big things that we're seeing at a building level is now having, in multi-let buildings, tower buildings particularly, flexible floors. So floors that are operated by a flex provider or a co-worker, but are available to all the tenants that give them an ability to work beyond their leased demise. And that's another form of flexibility. And then, as you rightly point out, Victor, there's the flexibility of the floor plate itself. There's a lot of talk about this. I think the inherent sort of challenge with flexibility of floor plate is actually something quite fundamental, which is furniture, and ensuring that you have modular furniture that enables you to create different settings and different styles very, very quickly. And talking to a range of office furniture providers, modular sort of furniture is a big deal, and it drives that flexibility. I think the other point around flexibility of design is, what's the office space for? And one of the things that worries me a little is that there's been huge numbers. I mean, as I said earlier, I've been in the market for 25 years. There's probably more workplace conferences in the last 6 years than there were in the previous 19 of my career. It's just like the thing to have a conference about. What's the future of work? What's the future of workplace? One of the problems I have with a lot of those conferences is they tend to elevate the position of collaborative workspaces. So what you tend to get is a definition of the future of the office being about a place where people come together to collaborate. And unfortunately, that is often taken as code for the office future is collaborative open plan space, what I call we space, where we come together. And my worry with that is that we end up designing offices that are actually not thinking about me space for individuals to actually focus down on task rather than collaborate. I think both are important, but we probably push the discussion about the office too far towards collaboration as being the reason for going to an office. And therefore, the design of office space has become more about open plan, collaborative spaces. And don't forget, it's much easier to create flexibility or density in a floor plate if it's open plan. You just push desks closer together. If you've got lots of individual work pods, whether they're traditional cellular offices or whether they're sort of telephone booth style settings, it's much more difficult to configure those in a flexible way. So there's a number of things going on, but I think as most things in life are about balance, right? About having the right balance of ingredients. And I think having me and we space together is very much the office of the future. There's this misnomer that people can work. Yeah, if people want to work with focus on their own, that they can do it at home, and that we've enabled them to do it at home. A lot of people are not in the position to, for various reasons, to work effectively with focus from home. They may live in co-living spaces. They may live in bedsits and not have the right facilities. They may live with multi-generational family members that make work difficult. They may have young children, old parents, whatever. So it's very, very difficult, I think, to be generalist about the way that people work. And what the workplace, what the office needs to be, in my view, is all things to all men or women, in the sense that it provides a range and a balance of workplace settings.
I would even add to that one extra thing that within the last few years, actually, there is a certain group of people for whom it was the first job to start working in the offices. They didn't know the offices in the old, let's say, times, let's call it like this. So
Yeah.
for them now, they were recruited working remotely. Then now they are being forced or invited to work in a hybrid model or the office model. So then taking them from the safe home to this, as you mentioned it, we space might be scary even for them, isn't it?
Well, I think there's a lot of that. I mean, I've got I've got three kids, but two of them are sort of just about going into university and thinking about the future of work, and the notion they have very little experience or knowledge of what working in an office was like or is like. They're also digital natives. Now, one of the things that always fascinates me about open plan floors is when you go to an open plan floor, how many people are actually collaborating? They usually got noise cancelling headphones in and they're working with focus. They're not talking to one another. You know, they've got their heads down, but they've used technology to almost provide blinkers so they can get on. And you know, most of the 20-year-olds are sort of digital natives now, so their go-to is technology, not people. And I actually think this links back to the point we were making earlier about culture and, you know, just ensuring that we have the right ways of working being enmeshed into our businesses by almost creating spaces that force particular behaviors. Sort of what the American psychologists and sociologists call nudge behaviors, you know, things that you do just a nudge. There's a lot of talk about water cooler moments, for example, in offices. Well, I think that's probably a little bit overplayed, but actually the notion of bringing people together and creating spaces that bring them together to exchange information. One thing that's often missing, Victor, in the discussion about the workplace is the role that the office has in educating people in the way of work, whether that's how you behave in a workplace at a very rudimentary level, or whether it's how you develop the skills to be a professional in your chosen field. I'm a firm believer, you know, again, I said 25 years in the industry. I'm probably on the fifth iteration of the death of the office. I keep getting told the office will die, and COVID was, you know, one of the big examples of that. Well, the office hasn't died, and one of the reasons it won't die is it's a place that people come together to build their careers. And I think we should be playing a much bigger role. The office should be playing a much bigger role, and the people that provide offices should be playing a much bigger role in making offices about education, about upskilling and reskilling staff. If you think about the big debate in the workplace at the moment, it's all about AI and this fear that AI is going to take away people's jobs. Well, actually, what AI does, in my view, and what AI will do for the next 20 years, is not take away people's jobs, but augment people's jobs, effectively making the more rudimentary tasks or the more laborious tasks of their job automated. And what that does is it creates capacity in people's jobs. And the obligation of most occupiers, most businesses that employ those people is to upskill and reskill them to ensure that capacity is utilized. Interesting, isn't it? Some of the biggest companies out there let's take the professional service firms. Look at where they're making their big investments. They're still taking physical spaces of high quality, but increasingly those spaces are about educational centers. Look at KPMG in Lakeview in Florida, which was pre-COVID. $106 million investment into a teaching conference facility for staff across the US. Deloitte have done the same in Paris by creating a Deloitte University on the outskirts of Paris, all about upskilling and reskilling people. Anything with a professional qualification, lawyers, accountants, real estate, all of that stuff, you have to learn your trade, your profession. And the way that you do that is not just by two-dimensional learning or by reading books. You do it by being in the market and understanding how more senior people operate and learning from them. Tacit learning. Office is important for that.
I would add to that one thing. In the beginning of this year, I was in Philippines, just talking to the business services industry over there. And besides upskilling and reskilling, which you have mentioned here, they have identified also the area of unskilling. So how they are teaching people of those things which they will never use again because they are either replaced by AI or technology or just other circumstances which are all around us. Yeah. So
Yeah.
this is something what those centers are also having in their education process. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think one of the interesting points there is probably going a little bit off topic, but I think one of the interesting points I'd make there is that I think the world is becoming more favourable to generalists rather than specialists. And so actually a lot of corporate education that will take place in offices is about providing a broad depth of skills rather than a very specific skill that can be ultimately automated or impacted by technology. So I think this is why, non-vocational learning is on a downward spiral, because, why do you want a specific degree around accounting? What you'd be much better having a general degree that enables you to move with the times. That's coming through to the corporate workplace as well.
Very much true, very much true. I will come back to this Australia example which you gave. So if I took it properly, you mentioned that there are buildings where in the buildings there are flexible areas for multi-tenants which they can use for the purposes of either growing or shrinking their office needs. Did I put it down correctly?
Yeah, I think that's broadly correct. And so there's two sort of dimensions to this. One is, if you already let a floor in the building, you can maximise the utilisation or the occupancy of that space. Let me give you a really good example. And this is very true of the Australian experience, and indeed it's becoming more prevalent in Europe. Isn't it interesting that historically, maybe just around the time of COVID, you'd go into a multi-let tower building and every floor that you'd visit had a boardroom, which was hardly ever used. Or if it was used by two people having a private one-to-one in a 25-seater room. Doesn't make any sense. Complete waste of space. What this model enables people to do is say, right, actually, we'll put all the meeting rooms into an operator, and we'll effectively lease those back on an hourly rate when we need them. But that means that the space that we host, that we lease on a conventional basis, can be maximised for appropriate uses, not just used for not space that's sort of left for boardrooms that are used once a month. And that model's proved very, very effective. But I think the learning I take from Australia is not the fact that that model's in place, but how it's operationalised. And by that I mean they don't just create amenity or shared meeting rooms. They actually curate and manage those amenities as well with a service layer. The one thing that I take away from my recent trip to Australia is the office is not just an environment. It's not just bricks and mortar or glass and steel. It's an experience. And for any space to be an experience, it has to have people. And it has to have people that manage the space. So we have this awful expression the Americans have brought in called the hotelification of the office, but effectively creating a service-based culture in the office experience. So when you go into a building, at the front desk, you're met in a way that you would expect of a five-star hotel. The whole experience is curated and managed with that level of service. In fact, Knight Frank's own building in Sydney, we're in a multi-let building in Sydney, and the whole of the ground floor plane, the front of house, the co-working space, the event space, the cafe space, all on the ground floor plane, is managed by Accor Hotels to a standard that you would expect of a hotel. And as a result, that experience as an office is one of the best that I've ever seen, because you feel like you're being welcomed in and everything's seamless. How much of that is an experience of the European occupier? I would argue probably not enough.
And here comes the question, if this is the scenario which actually Europe or US will follow, because it sounds like a really, really good scenario.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think we're seeing that already in some of the best buildings in markets like London and Berlin and Paris. And I was in Paris a couple of weeks ago. There's definitely that sort of service-led office building starting to come at the very top of the market. It's also a great opportunity for landlords, incidentally. You can actually monetize areas of operation, so you can create potentially additional revenue streams or increase service charges by making the space better serviced and better managed. But yes, it's definitely we're definitely seeing more of that now in Europe, and I don't tend to spend as much time in the US, but I think the very best buildings in the US are probably in that area. I think you have Hudson Yards and the like, but there's a lot of poor office buildings in America as well. Controversial view, but true.
Yeah, so I put a lot of notes today. To be honest, if I take a look on the time, which has already gave us 30 minutes of a talk, I don't even know when it passed. I can imagine that we could talk about those experiences in the office for much longer time. But anyway, the formula of this podcast is not allowing us to go more
Sure.
within this topic. But my summary of this talk, that the office is not an environment, it is an experience. I really like this sentence which you have put in here, and listening to this word of flexibility, which appeared a lot of times during our talk, it looks like the offices just need to be flexible from either perspective of setting up proper places to work there, to stay there, to take this culture of the organization, and so on and so on. But what else I really like, this what you have put within our today's talk, is this we space and my space. And this, I think, is the way how we should look into the offices, aren't we?
I would agree with that, but you're right. There's a very rich conversation to be had here. Maybe we need a trilogy of podcasts to get through all the topics. But it's been great. I think your summation is spot on. You know, flexible work demands flexible spaces. Period. And we should be thinking about that.
Ali, thank you very much for today. I think it is not going to be our last talk, especially that it really went completely outside of the area where we were supposed to talk today. But I think it was really very much interesting, and giving people views that there is a different approach to offices in different parts of the world, and definitely getting the best examples from the places where they just work. I think it's the way to go. So thank you very much for today.
Victor, my pleasure. Great to speak to you.